when Star Tribune asked me to talk about Midwest grit, I said, "You mean like 3M sandpaper?" Thank you. Uh, I'm here all day. Uh, but truly, sandpaper uh, is unique because 3M actually invented wet or dry sandpaper about a century ago. And so I guess as Minnesotans, it's probably okay that we can brag about it a little bit. For those non-Minnesotans, we don't like to brag. Now, what's interesting about sandpaper is that it creates something that lasts. It's You can't go from rough to polished in one step. It takes step by step, grit by grit. And what I found here in the Midwest is a similar kind of characteristic. The culture is steady, it's patient, and it's purposeful. And it shows up in how we build, how we endure, and how we get together. And so the team asked me to talk about my personal lessons from MedTech breakthroughs. Now you may be wondering, how did this guy get on stage with all these heavy hitters today? I grew up in Mountain View, California, and was born there as well. And I went to school with people whose parents were Apple founders, or whose parents actually built the first computers at Apple. And I was just this kid with a bowl cut, haircut, thinking actually, that this was completely normal. But as many of you know, it's tough to see a culture when you're born into it. And it's easier to see it when you leave it or move into a new one. And so I went to college. Don't worry, this isn't the picture from the 90s. I didn't not age, but but I went to UC San Diego in nanotechnology and specifically computing. And what I learned was that when you shift one area of computing in memory or computing power, a whole other end of the boundary conditions of computing get to leap forward. And we're seeing that now in AI, where AI in the software side is allowing everything else to leap forward as well. And so about 25 years ago, I moved to Minnesota, to Seagate Technology, literally designing the technology in hard drives that put in more gigabytes and now terabytes into the digital world, literally the zeros and ones. And as many of you know, as transplants, you might move here for a job, but you stay here for love. So I think my wife's out there somewhere. I want to thank her, because to be a spouse of an entrepreneur is really the hero's work. But if you don't believe that I'm truly Minnesotan, here's some few pictures of the state fair the last few years. Truly, of course, it's the #1 fair in the world. But after a few years in development, Seagate tapped me on the shoulder and asked me if I would develop the first solid-state drive for the company, and actually, so thus the world. And what's interesting now, looking back, is that solid state is one of the key pillars in AI infrastructure. After that, I was invited to Dell to lead an operating system team to integrate that same technology into operating systems. And what I learned through all these experiences is that in the Midwest, we're really good at collaboration, leading it from here around the coast or even around the world. What I also learned was that in this region, our anchor institutions, some of you saw earlier on the panel, form a fabric that weaves throughout our communities that creates our culture. Whether it's the University of Minnesota helping in the seminal days of Medtronic, and then Medtronic helping birth Medical Alley, and of course with Mayo Clinic, the birthing of that from the tragedy of the tornado over 130 years ago, when Mother Mose from the Sisters of St. Francis worked with Dr. Mayo to create what's truly innovative actually for the world, is a hospital system so good that it's a destination for the world. But about 13 years ago, after 15 years in tech, I was diagnosed with blood cancer. And it was difficult because I was actually resistant to chemotherapy. And I was given even more potent drugs that nearly killed me. And so, luckily, I survived. Actually, we survived. But when you go through something like this, it really affects everything about how you see the world and how you form your purpose. And so from that point, I switched from tech into health tech. And so one of the first companies I created was one that actually was rooted in the question that I had while I was going through chemo, is why do we take medicines and drugs that are developed on animals that don't actually work on people? And so we developed a technology, a licensed technology from a Nobel Prize winner in biology, is the ability to take skin cells and reprogram into stem cells and then to other organ cells, and in this case, brain cells. Kind of like what Peter was talking about earlier this morning. And here is a video of that same neurosphere. Some people call mini brains. They're about 0.5 millimeter in size. And you can see that pulsing of light. This pulsing of a light is the release of calcium, and it's actually the neural network of about 40,000 brain cells. But that's the wow. If you want to change an industry, you actually want to make something extremely consistent in scale. And so we did. This is done here in Minnesota. We made almost 400 brains per plate that we ship all over the world. And so in Minnesota, I guess you can say, we don't just grow grains, we grow brains. So the purpose, though, drove us. I mean, in startup, there's so much difficulty, left, right, ups and downs. But one of the things to compare the costs is you might be able to raise millions or billions of dollars on flash and and the coast where I'm from, they often say, well, you leap off the cliff and you build the rocket ship on the way down and see if you make it. And there's brilliance in that boldness. But here, we have a little bit more process, right? We lead with that process and that infrastructure, that certainty. And so after 8 years getting Stemonics off the ground and taking a little break working with startups, the University of Minnesota tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, can you take a look at a few technologies? And one of them stopped me dead in my tracks. The team at Boston Scientific and the University of Minnesota were working on a new type of sensor, quantum sensors. And they said that they could take breath and it could be a window into health. And I thought they were BSing me. So they told me, no, look at the data. I looked at the data, and then they said, dogs don't just smell explosives in airports, but they can also smell disease, and they're very accurate in cancer. And there's a lady in England, Joy Milne, who can smell Parkinson's years before there are symptoms and before there's diagnoses. So there's something in the breath. So it turns out that our bodies produce what are called volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. Our about 37 trillion cells in the body actually are produced, and they get into the bloodstream, and then we're able to exhale them, because every 30 seconds, or 60 seconds, our whole blood volume passes through our respiratory systems, and our VOCs are able to escape. And it turns out that diseases have a unique chemical pattern. Here's lung cancer. The green bars are healthy patients, and the red hash bars is the pattern of lung cancer. So this morning when Peter talked about genomics and the price drop of genomics, there's other omics, metabolomics, proteomics. You'll hear it here maybe for the first time, volatilomics. And it can be much, much cheaper. Now, it didn't start that way. So it took truckloads of equipment at Boston Scientific and University of Minnesota to do the first ones. And after multiple years, it got smaller and smaller, until about 3 years ago, we spun out Vocxi Health to make something that took truckloads into the size of a credit card. And so here it is. It's mobile, and that if we believe we can get it this small and even smaller, that could make huge differences in the lives of patients, our health systems, how we even respond to major pandemics. And so what gets us this technology? Well, inside are quantum sensors that leverage graphene, which won the Nobel Prize in 2010, which is a single atomic layer of carbon that we're able to put on these sensors at scale, and that's actually one of the biggest challenges. Then they spent 8 years developing novel chemistries to put on top of that graphene, so it has the sensitivity not at the parts per million like most electronic sensors, but at the parts per billion, 1,000 times more. And now intersecting that with AI and machine learning allows us to look at patterns that I mentioned before from breath to differentiate and see which patterns may exist from just a single minute of breathing. And so it takes perseverance. But we know so well that in the Midwest, it doesn't just happen overnight. Here, it took over a decade because we know from our ag background that you just can't rush a harvest. And so that leads me to change. We talked a lot about it today. And the interesting thing is that AI is moving 3 times the speed of Moore's law, as some people are saying, which is saying that if you don't know Moore's law, the computing power is doubling every 2 years. So that's then saying that AI capability is doubling every 7 to 8 months, and we're kind of seeing it. And so I have a concept that I have been mentioning to people that we're not just at a change, we're at a change singularity. Change singularity is saying that the change is moving so quickly that it's stressing our systems, our schools, our social structures, even the environment. And you heard earlier, and I've seen some statistics, that the data center production of CO2 emissions may be 2 to 7 times that of the whole airline industry in the next handful of years. And so when innovation moves that quickly, and it stresses and we forget the why behind what we're doing it for, we have the risk of losing our humanity, and we then have a risk of losing our gravity. And what I mean by that is our communities are brought together by these ideas. But when innovation moves so quickly, when we forget about our purpose, then the force that keeps us together begins to drift away. And so we are often asked, we ask ourselves, what's next? And the challenge is, it's an infinite number of answers. Maybe a more useful question is, what will never change? What do we need as a community, as people? And psychologists often talk about human needs that won't ever change in light of all the change that's coming at us. Certainty, uncertainty, love and connection, significance, contribution, and growth. AI addresses some of these. The uncertainty, the excitement of AI is incredible. The growth and the change is incredible. But what about love and connection? What about community like we've talked about today? And contribution? What happens when within not 100 years that we talked about earlier in the graphs that Peter showed, but also the change happens in weeks, where whole communities are losing massive jobs? So those are the things that we have to be aware of. This comic made me laugh. I saw this a few weeks ago. The fastest things on Earth isn't the cheetah airplane speed of light, but people becoming experts in AI. Now, there's one thing that's faster than that, and we all have it, but we have to use it, and it's imagination. Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge, and I'll say that imagination is more powerful than change. And so when we look at this equation that I came up with just to get the point through, imagination by itself can spark, but with some Minnesota grit, people, purpose, perseverance, the spark that created something new allows us to then, with perseverance, see it through, driving more meaningfulness. And so you can have simple materials, silicon carbide. You can have to make sandpaper, wafers, some metals to make quantum sensors. The battery is out. Can someone advance one, please? Thank you. And then one more since we're at it. These are ordinary materials, but with imagination can lead to things that are extraordinary. And so here's this interesting thing. Beautiful stained glass that's timeless. It's sand. And so what's interesting about it is with grit, you can shape it. With grit, you can piece it together. And with imagination, you can let light shine through to reveal what's possible. Because I think what's challenging us in society is how can we imagine boldly, but can we sprinkle in a little Midwest grit so we can create what actually matters? And so disruption alone doesn't build the future. People do. And community sustains it, purpose drives it, and perseverance carries it forward. Thank you.